Well, this morning we are going to dive right back into our series on the Sermon on the Mount. And this morning we come to Jesus' teaching on prayer. And this is a huge part of life. Even people who think of themselves as atheists or agnostics, when surveyed, most of them will admit, there are times when even I, as an agnostic or as an atheist, I come to the end of my rope and I pray. And the truth is, for some reason, we just can't seem to help ourselves. We're just wired to reach out beyond ourselves, kind of in those key moments of life. And this is the human condition. When we're desperate, we call out for God. But I think that we know there has to be more to prayer than just desperation. More than just sort of this shot from the hip sort of prayers. And for Jesus, of course, there was. Nobody ever prayed like Jesus. Nobody ever believed in the power of prayer like Jesus. Nobody ever made prayer a part of their life and their life a part of their prayer. And we'll get to that in a little bit. The way that Jesus did. He's the master of prayer. And he has a whole lot to teach us about it. And he begins with this in the Sermon on the Mount, in this whole section on prayer. He begins with this in Matthew chapter 6, verses 5 to 8. He says, "And when you pray, do not be like the hypocrites," like actors. "For they love to pray standing in the synagogues and on the street corners to be seen by others. Truly, I tell you, they have received their reward in full. But when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. And when you pray, do not keep on babbling like the pagans, for they think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them, for your Father knows what you need before you ask Him." Jesus says when you pray, and this is the heart of what we're talking about today, when you pray, be sincere. Pray authentically. The point is never to be impressive, to say something impressive, or to find that magic combination of words that will somehow unlock God. Jesus says, you know what? Here it is. Just be sincere. Just be you. Just bring the real you before the real God. Just learn to be present before God. And when you think about the life of Jesus, I think, at least for me, one thing is deeply striking. Somehow Jesus learned to live, or just lived, moment by moment, in this conscious awareness of being in God's presence. Wherever he was, whatever he was doing, whatever he was talking about, God was present. God was right there with him, and Jesus knew it. Jesus counted on it. His words were impacted by it. His actions were determined by it. His whole life essentially was characterized by it. And when Jesus invites us to become people of prayer, learning to be fully present before God is the ultimate goal. It's just the real you before the real God. Now, sometimes you're talking directly to God, and sometimes not. I want us to kind of think about how this works. When it comes to being present before someone, there are basically three ways to go about this. And to show you this, I'm going to need a little bit of help. And so I've asked for a couple of people to come and help me. And so Leah, would you come on up here? All right. Doing a great job so far. All right. The first category of being present is when you speak directly to another person, okay? And let's call Leah person A. Person A. Okay, now sometimes you speak directly to person A. And so I might say, what do you think of my sermon so far?
Fantastic.
Oh, good answer. Now that was awkward. Okay, sometimes though, you're not speaking directly to person A. Sometimes you're speaking to someone else, and so let's call that person B. And so, Brittany, where are you? Oh, here comes Brittany. Brittany is person B. So now I'm talking to person B, and we're having this amazing dialogue, but the whole time, person A is right here listening. So now I'm speaking in front of person A to person B, okay? And because of that, I tend to filter my words that I'm saying to person B because person A is present. Person A is right here listening. Or maybe, even though I'm talking to person B, my words are actually more directed, where I'm pointing with my elbow, at person A. You know what I'm talking about? Have you ever seen this happen in conversation? Okay, this used to happen to me when I was like in the grocery store. My kids were little, and I'd have the little baby, the cute little baby in the cart, and I'd be checking out, in the line, and some lady would come up behind me in the line, and she'd start talking to the baby. She'd say, "Little girl, you're so cute." She'd be talking to Caitlin. Caitlin's 6 months old, and her arms are going like this, and her legs are kicking. And she's going, "Oh, little sweetheart, you're so cute. You're so cute." And she'd reach in, and she'd grab her by the arm. She'd say, "Oh, honey, your arms are so cold. Doesn't your daddy know that you need a sweater or a coat on?" Shut up, lady, I'm right here. Come on. Okay, so in scenario number 2, I'm speaking to person B, but I'm speaking in front of person A, and I'm speaking with this very conscious awareness of the fact that person A is right here listening to what I'm saying, and so their presence shapes my words. And like I said, that might be a filter. I might be filtering what I say, or like if Brittany said to me, "Hey, what do you think of Leah?" That's awkward. Because I would be very aware that Leah is present. But if I were asked that question, I would say amazing things because I really like Leah. Okay, third scenario, I can also speak in the absence of person A. And now I'm speaking to person B, but person A is not here anymore. Okay, so I don't have to worry at all about how this is going to affect person A, what they might think about what I'm saying. Okay? Awesome. Thank you. So, nice. That was polite. Let's give him a polite little golf clap. So I want a little group confession. I want to see where the hearts of our church are on this. Raise your hand if you've ever spoken about somebody in their absence and you've said words that you would not have said if they were present. Yeah, hold them high. Get them up there. Don't put them down. Get them up there. Get it out. This is good for the soul. And the truth is, we all guard what we're going to say depending on who's present, who's listening. You think about in job interviews. I mean, job interviews are just such a farce. Like, you think about job interviews. Okay, when a person is asked in a job interview, what is your greatest weakness? Does anybody know what the number one answer to that is? I work too hard. Lots of you knew. Lots of you knew right away what the number one answer is. I just work too hard. My standards are just too high. I'm just too driven. I just don't do enough self-care. Don't set enough boundaries. Just work too hard. That's my biggest problem. Are you kidding me? I mean, wouldn't it be refreshing if someone actually got honest in a job interview? Like someone came in and said, "Well, actually, my biggest problem is that I'm so stinking lazy you wouldn't believe it." In fact, sometimes in my last job, when a task would be unpleasant or it would be difficult, I would decide that maybe I should just check Facebook. Just real quick. And then I'd get sort of lost in Facebook land, and I could literally spend hours and hours on Facebook while everybody else thought I was working. How many of you have ever interviewed people? How many of you have ever heard someone say that their biggest weakness is they're too lazy? Never. Are you kidding? See, what happens is we filter what we say based on who's present. Okay, now here's the spiritual reality of our world, a reality that Jesus was very, very clear about. Okay, when it comes to God, I'm never in situation number 3. Never. I'm never acting or speaking in the absence of God. Like David had this realization when he wrote this in Psalm 139. He says, "Where can I go from your spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." Okay? And I think intellectually, when we think, if we're people that are Christians and we go, yeah, I believe this. I do, I believe this, but at the same time, often it doesn't feel like God is present. Now, why is that? You ever think about that? Like, why doesn't God make his presence more obvious? Well, I think God does this for a very important reason. Okay, another little group confession. How many of you drive more carefully when you see a police car? Why? Why is that? Is it because suddenly you're reminded of your deepest values and your heart is transformed and suddenly you love the law? No, man. The truth is you don't want to get pulled over, okay? Bottom line, you don't want a ticket. So it's like, oh, when you're stepping on the gas, even if you were going under the speed limit, it's just natural. Whoa. But see, God doesn't want to police your life. He doesn't want forced compliance from you. You think about that. I mean, a lot of people haven't really thought this through. But imagine, if you and I experienced God in all of his fullness at every moment, he's just too big and too glorious for us to live with this sense of real freedom. So to allow us a sense of personal freedom, God enables us to live as if he were absent. And this reality can lead to all sorts of really goofy stuff. Sometimes groups of Christians that I've been around in the past, and probably many of you have seen this as well, they like to play this little game before meals. Now maybe some of you have seen this or played this. I'm not shaming anyone. I'm just saying this is kind of odd. And this game is a little bit different in different places. And the way it works is everybody's sitting around the table, and right before it's time to eat, like everybody touches their nose, or everybody puts their thumb up, or whatever it is. But the idea is that the last person to do whatever it is that everybody's supposed to do, touch their nose, raise their thumb, that's the last person to realize that that's going on and get caught not doing it, that's the person that has to pray for the meal. So this little game happens. And everybody giggles and they snicker because they realize who it is that's going to have to pray. And then that person gets caught, and that person then goes into the prayer and says, God, we just love you so much. And it's just so good to be able to come and pray to you. Now, don't you think, like if God is watching that, and I think he is, that he must be going like, hey, if it's like really good to pray to me, then how come it's the loser that has to get stuck with it? I mean, it's almost as if God isn't present when we're playing the game, and then all of a sudden the prayer starts, and suddenly we are all transported into the presence of God. You ever seen somebody that has a very normal speaking voice, and then when they pray, it's like they become this whole other person, this whole other voice just breaks out? Why do people tend to do that? Well, we live in this bizarre kind of like spiritual insanity where it's like, okay, when we're ready, then we remember, oh yeah, God's watching now. And we can live large chunks of our lives as if God is absent. And what Jesus is getting at here is the whole goal of prayer is not to get like really good at praying, become really impressive, be able to blow people away. The real goal isn't to learn to say just the right thing. It's not to set like new records, for time spent in prayer. The real goal of prayer is to learn to live all of my life, to learn to speak all of my words in the joyful awareness of the presence of God. That's it. That's what it's for. That's what Jesus did. He lived his whole life in the conscious awareness of his Father. For instance, he goes to Lazarus, who's dead. He goes to his tomb. And Jesus knows he's going to raise Lazarus up back to life. And people gather to see this. And Jesus prays this fascinating prayer. This is John chapter 11, verse 41. And it says, "So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said," okay, so Jesus was about to pray. And this is kind of interesting because in our day, when most people pray, what do? They close their eyes and they bow their head. And yet in this case, Jesus does the exact opposite. He opens his eyes and he looks up, wide open. Now, there's nothing wrong with closing our eyes and bowing our heads. And the idea of that makes a whole lot of sense. It goes way, way, way back to ancient cultures. This is how, when you were brought into the presence of a king, this is the posture that you held when you were in the presence of a king. You kneeled and you bowed down and you avoided eye contact. It was a classic posture of reverence. And it was about honor for the king, okay? So it makes sense when you think about it that we would assume this posture sometimes when we pray. But when you read the New Testament, oftentimes this was not the posture that Jesus would take. And here, instead of bowing his head with closed eyes, he looks up to heaven and he's reminding everybody that's watching, okay, God is right here. God is right here, right now. And this is what he says, okay, verses 41 to 42. It says, "So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, 'Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me. But I said this for the benefit of people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me.'" I knew, Jesus said, you always hear me. Okay, not just when Jesus prays, but all the time. Whenever he talks, whoever he talked to, always, 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 God was listening. Always, 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 God was responding to Jesus' words, whether they were addressing the Father or they were addressing somebody else. See, for Jesus, the line between praying and just speaking was very thin. And Jesus wants it to become thin for his followers as well. Like sometimes, if you notice this, sometimes when Jesus healed a person, he would speak directly to the person he was healing. And sometimes when he healed someone, he would speak directly to the Father. It didn't really matter much to Jesus who he was speaking to because he was always speaking in front of the Father. And the Father was always responding. And he was so aware of God's presence. And often, Jesus would just break away to go be alone. Jesus would take time away from all of the stuff that was going on and all the craziness to just focus on the presence of God. And Jesus did that because he understood something deep about spiritual life. We all need to break away on a regular basis. We need to get alone, and we need to focus very intentionally on the presence of God. And this is why in verse 6 that we looked at the beginning, Jesus said, okay, but when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Then your Father who sees what is done in secret will reward you. Okay, this is not saying that it's not good to pray corporately with other people. It is good. But we all need to have regular private times with God as well. We need it. Our soul needs it. The human personality has been compared to the ancient temple in Israel. And I didn't come up with this analogy, but I think it's helpful. And the idea is that there are layers to our personality, just like there were layers to the temple in Jesus' day. Okay, the temple was divided into different compartments, and there was what we would call the outer court, okay, in the temple. And the corresponding piece of this to you is that there is a public you. You have an outer court. There's a part of you that everybody sees. This is your appearance and your image, and everybody really that can see you has access to this part of you. Okay, but then in the temple there was another chamber, an inner chamber, and it was called the holy place. And not everybody had access to this place. Some people were outside of it. You have a holy place. It's a place where you only allow certain people to come in. Maybe your friends, maybe your family, just certain people. And you get to decide who comes in there and who doesn't. Nobody can just sort of force their way into that place. I mean, somebody may hold a lot of external power over you, and this may be going on in your life right now. Maybe it's a boss, maybe it's a teacher, maybe it's a coach, maybe it's a parent. But that power doesn't get them into that chamber for you. Okay, you have to invite them in. We all get to control who comes in there. You have a holy place. And then there's one more, like even deeper inner chamber. It was one small, very carefully guarded chamber way inside the temple. And it was the most sacred space with a beautiful name. Does anybody remember what that space was called? The Holy of Holies. It's the Holy of Holies. Just one person and God in there. And this is the mystery and the depth and the amazing truth about you. Whether you're young or old, whether you're high or low on the totem pole, you've got one of those. You've got this place where only God is allowed. No other human being can come into your Holy of Holies. And the truth is, there are depths in you that no one else will know. Like, even if you wanted them to know, even if you wanted to express them, there are depths to you that you can't even put into words. There are depths in you that you don't even know yourself. It's the Holy of Holies. It's your heart. It's your soul. And you carry it with you all the time. Now, right now, yours could be filled with all kinds of things. It could be filled with joy. Could be filled with peace. Could be happiness, strength, hope. Or it could be empty. You could be coming in here this morning and it's empty. And it's neglected. And it's dried. And it's withered. Could be filled with anxiety, fear, shame. But see, the people who just look at you, they're just looking at the outer court. They don't really know. And even the people that are in your inner court, they don't fully know. No one knows except God and you. And Jesus says God cares deeply about what's going on in there. This is the part of you that God cares about the most. So Jesus is saying, look, prayer isn't about how you look on the outer court. Prayer is about what's going on deep in your heart. Prayer is learning to bring the real you before the real God. Now we look at that and we say, okay, what would that look like? Like if I was going to pray sincerely, how would I do that? I mean, how would we actually go about praying from the deepest part of our heart? Well, Jesus is going to give us an example. And it's a pretty cool example. In verse 9, he says, this then is how you should pray. He's been talking about pray sincerely, pray from your heart. And he says, this then is how you should pray. And here we come to some of the most well-known words that have ever been uttered in human history. Words that have become memorized and recited probably more than any other words ever spoken in human history. Jesus says, this then is how you should pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us today our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we also have forgiven our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from the evil one. These are some of the most well-known words on planet Earth. And here, Jesus is giving us this example of what heartfelt prayer might look like. It might include worship. Hallowed be your name. It might include asking God to change things on earth. Okay, God, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. It might include asking God for your wants and your needs. God, give us today our daily bread. It might include confession. God, forgive us our debts, forgive us our trespasses, forgive us our sins. It might include asking for strength. God, lead us not into temptation, but deliver us. But the point is, these are simple but very heartfelt words. The point isn't, the point is absolutely not that these are magic words. That if we somehow memorize these and then we recite them regularly, somehow we will earn God's favor, like we will unlock, God's tight-fisted generosity. All this is simply an example of what heartfelt, humble prayer might look like. And so when you get alone with God, and you need to get alone with God, what's the whole point? It's to learn to be sincere. It's the real you before the real God. It's not about the outer court. It's about the Holy of Holies. Now, we live in a culture that's all about the outer court. It's all about how you look. It's all about your image. If we're not careful, that can be all that we pay attention to. And Jesus is warning us here, man, don't neglect the inner stuff. That's the real you. That's the stuff that matters. So find a place on a regular basis where you won't be distracted. A place where you can just pour your heart out to God. I just want to say, guys, do you do this? Like, is this a regular part of your life? And maybe it has been. For some of you, maybe it has been at times. My question is it these days? Because here's what I know about me. When this is happening regularly in my life, there is a burden that's lifted. It's just like, whew. And I see things differently. And I start to approach life from a rock-solid foundation. I have a renewed energy for tackling hard stuff. I have a heart that I find is growing softer and softer. But when I don't do this regularly, it's the exact opposite. So I've seen the rewards of getting alone with God, and yet, and this is crazy for me, it's so easy for me to stop doing this. Like my schedule starts to get full, life gets stressful, I start to feel anxiety, I start to have worries about stuff that's coming up in my life, about the future. I get hit with a problem that freaks me out, and what do? I stew on it. I fixate on it. I let it freak me out. But I don't talk to God about it. Now, knowing what I know about prayer, that is absolutely absurd, but it happens all the time. And so I'm not talking to you guys about this stuff because I have like the ideal prayer life, okay? Far from it. But I've tasted what it is to start doing this. And I have to tell you, man, I'm hungry for it because it's just such a better way to live. And it's the way that God is inviting us to live. In chapter 7, a little farther along in the sermon, Jesus kind of stops talking about prayer, talks about some other stuff for a while, and he comes back to prayer. And here's what he says, Matthew chapter 7, verses 7 to 11. He says, "Ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open to you. For everyone who asks receives. The one who seeks finds, and to the one who knocks, the door will be opened. Which of you, if your son asks for bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks for a fish, will give him a snake? If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him?" Jesus says, "Ask and it will be given. Seek and you will find. Knock and the door will be open." And these are all terms that described beggars. Guys, this is what beggars do. They ask and they seek and they knock and they're pleading. And to be honest, this is a part of why I resist prayer. And this is a big part of why prayer is so critical for me. Prayer is something that beggars do. Now, I don't know about you, but I forget sometimes that when it comes to life, I'm a beggar. Like when it comes to our church, it comes to my family, it comes to the stuff that really matters, I'm not strong enough. And I'm not smart enough. And I'm not educated enough. And I'm not gifted enough. And I'm not big enough. And I'm not connected enough. And whenever I forget that, and whenever I think, you know what, I've got this all figured out, I end up flat on my face in ways that are just painful. So prayer reminds me that I'm a beggar. Like sometimes having resources or education or job titles or power or connections or giftedness of any kind, although those can all be good things that are like from God, they can end up being the very things that keep me from remembering how desperately I need God. How ultimately I don't control anything. How ultimately, in reality, I'm a beggar. There's this great picture of this in the Old Testament. Hezekiah is the king over God's people, over Israel. And he gets a letter from the king of Assyria. Now, Assyria was huge. It was massive, powerful. I mean, this is like the United States compared to Haiti. Assyria is just huge. They could obliterate Israel if they wanted to. And the king of Assyria sends Hezekiah a letter. He says, here's the deal. We've decided to wipe you out and take your land. And we're a lot bigger and stronger than you. So there's nothing you can do to stop us. You'd be an idiot to try. But I'm going to make you a deal you can't refuse. I will let you and your people live, but you will be our subjects. You'll have to worship our gods, and you will have to live however we tell you. So tell your people to give up your God and make this deal with me, and I'll let you live. Whew, that's a tough letter. And humanly speaking, he was right. This would be no contest. There's no way Israel could stand up to Assyria. That Hezekiah is the king, and he's responsible for his people, and he loves his people, and he loves God, and this is a horrible situation. What's he going to do? I love this picture. This is 2 Kings 19:14. It says, Hezekiah received the letter from the messengers and read it. Then he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And that's such a powerful image to me. He's like, this is way over my head. Okay, God, you read this. And in desperation, he takes this letter like a beggar and he lays it out before God. And then he just cries out. He just cries out and prays the most desperate prayer, asking God to deliver him and his people. And God does. It's amazing how often we're faced with a really difficult situation, something that seems impossible. And we stew on it, and we have all this anxiety over it, but we don't lay it out before God. We internalize it, we lose sleep over it, we let fear and anxiety reign. Jesus says, you know what? Don't do that. Don't do that. Take it to God. Ask, seek, knock. So I just want to say, I don't know what you might need to lay out before God. Maybe for you, it's a big old stack of bills. Maybe it's a relational thing. Maybe it's news from the doctor. Maybe it's a divorce paper. But Jesus says, don't walk through it alone. Don't internalize it. Lay it out before God. Ask, seek, knock. And sometimes for whatever reason, like we're hesitant to be honest with God. We're afraid to talk with God about what's really on our heart. Paul writes this in Philippians 4:6, writing to Christian friends of his. He says, do not be anxious about anything, but in everything, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God. And the most remarkable thing is here, the most remarkable word here is the word everything. Talk to God about everything, about anything. Talk to God about whatever it is that's on your mind. Like, do you have a deep desire for a romantic relationship? Tell God. I mean, do you have a deep passion to be successful at work? Then talk to God. And people worry, and they say, well, if I do that, then God might think I'm selfish. Do you think God doesn't already know? I guess the quickest way to kill your prayer life is to pretend that you care about stuff that you don't give a rip about. I mean, what God wants most is for you to be close to Him. And in any relationship, as soon as you start getting superficial, like as soon as you do the Miss America thing, the only thing I want is world peace. It just creates this sense of artificiality, and it kills prayer. It kills relationships. So come to God with what it is that's really on your heart. And you can use things like the Lord's Prayer to guide you. You can go, Our Father in heaven. You can remember how good God is, the things that he's done in the past in your life, things that he's brought you through. You can remember that he loves you, that he's working on your behalf all the time, that he's separate from everything that isn't good, that would be wrong or evil. You can say, Hallowed be your name. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Okay, your will be done on earth. And you can go, oh yeah, I want that too. I want God's kingdom to come in my family. I want it to come at school. I want his kingdom to come where I work. I want his kingdom to come in the life of my friend. I really do want that. And so you can sort of use the prayer as a guide, but it's not a substitute for your own sincere prayer. And one last thing. There's a word that just keeps coming up when Jesus teaches. And I wish that there were a way to imprint this on all of our hearts. Jesus says, when you pray, pray to your Father. Jesus says, your Father will reward you. Jesus says, your Father knows what you need. Jesus says, when you pray, pray like this: Our Father who art in heaven. Jesus says, even though, we're fallen and we're all imperfect, and every one of us as a parent is twisted up with all sorts of weirdness, we still love to give good gifts to our kids. We do. We love it. Jesus says, think about it. How much more would that be true of God? I mean, yeah, he's our king, and he is filled with indescribable glory. But Jesus says, never, never forget, he's your Father and you're his child. And so I want to just invite you to bow your heads right now for a moment and just close your eyes. And I want to just have kind of a private time between you and God, a time to search your heart and talk directly and openly with him. I mean, think for a minute. What's the biggest burden that's weighing on you today? What is it that just melts you, that just breaks you? Maybe something that you try not to think about. But the truth is, it's always there. It's always kind of lingering in your mind. And maybe it's a health deal. You're so worried. Or maybe it's your financial situation. Or maybe it's your career or your lack of a career. Maybe it's a person. Maybe if you're a parent, it's a son or a daughter. Maybe it's your marriage. Maybe it's a betrayal. Maybe it's guilt. Maybe it's an addiction that you've been battling. And maybe nobody knows but God. Maybe it's your love life or lack of it. And I don't know what it might be for you, but I want to remind you, God knows. In your Holy of Holies, he's in there. He knows, he sees, and he cares. And so today, maybe the most important thing you could do is to talk to him about it. And maybe like Hezekiah, you just need to lay it out before him. But you need to search your heart. Like, what's really going on in there? What scares you? What keeps you up at night? What's going on in the inner chamber of your heart? All right, you can open your eyes. Inside of your bulletin, there are two little blank pieces of paper. And if you don't have a bulletin, maybe somebody next to you has one that they could share with you. In fact, if you don't have one and you would like one, would you just kind of put your hand up for a second? I want everyone to have access to this morning. Can those of you that have extras, can you get them to people that are in need? Here's what I want you to do this morning. These guys are gonna lead us in worship and help us to think about who God is, and they're gonna kind of start this with a longer instrumental. I just want you to think, if you had something come to mind when you had your head bowed, I just encourage you, I just want to invite you to write that down. And then when we're worshiping, if it feels right to you, the time is right, I just encourage you to come up and lay it here at the altar. Just kind of give it over to God. And I also want to say, as we worship, in kind of the spirit of being sincere, I just want to say there's no like right posture for worship. Some of you like to stand when you worship. Some of you like to sit. Some of you like to sit with your head bowed, eyes closed. That's very appropriate. Some of you like to stand with your hands raised. That's very appropriate. Some of you like to do all of that at different times. In the spirit of being sincere, and by the way, this is not just for this morning. This is like, every week. I want you to be authentic. I want you to be sincere. If you're somebody who likes to stand, stand. If you want to sit with head bowed, sit with head bowed. If you want to raise your hands, raise your hands. Just be you. Be the real you before the real God as we worship this morning.